Welcome to Spotlight Philippians, invitation to joy as we continue to look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. In our last devotional, we looked at verses 1 and 2a, where Paul appealed to the fact that there was a mutual affection between him and the church in Philippi, and because they had a shared affection, they had a shared joy. They had comfort from one another. They had sympathy with one another. They had love with one another. And that love, sympathy, all of that comfort made them want to fulfill one another's joy. And so Paul says, there's some things you can do, Philippians, that will help my joy to be full. What are they? What are the things that Paul wants the Philippians to do that will fill full his joy? Now, maybe we stop and think in our day and age, Paul's going to ask them to do something for him, an act or a deed, or to supply some need of his, or to communicate with him in some way or another, something that Paul needed personally. But that's not how Paul responds. Let's pick up the passage and hear what will make Paul just joyful from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. We look again at Philippians chapter 2. Complete my joy by what? By being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord, and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but to the interests of others. I love this about Paul. What Paul says will fill full his joy is if the Philippians live in community with one another in a particular way. Let's break it down very quickly for today. First of all, the thing he emphasizes is unity. I want you, I'll be just tickled pink if I hear that you're unified, that you have the same love, that you have the same affection for one another, that you are in full accord and of one mind. Paul elevates unity among the believers as a great virtue and a great value. Sometimes I wonder if we do this enough in the church, if we don't do enough to celebrate and to emphasize that we should be one in the Spirit and one in faith and one in mind and one in reason and purpose. And the next things that Paul says just amplify and make that a reality if they are put into practice. First of all, he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit. What breaks unity among believers or a group of people more quickly than being selfish and self-centered? If I'm self-centered and you're self-centered, then we're not going to be unified with one another. And so often, at least in my years in practice with the church, underneath the disagreements, what color should be the carpet? Where should the pulpit be? How do we do this? How do we do that? It's not so much about the issue. Sometimes it's about who gets to make the decision, who has the control. And underneath that attitude, of course, is a little bit of selfish ambition and sometimes a measure of conceit. And Paul says, you gotta put that stuff to death in your relationships to one another. Nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit. Let's dig deeply into our souls and see if that is a driver for us and put it to death. Instead, says Paul, we are to walk in humility towards one another. Boy, the first thing that'll kill selfish ambition and conceit is to humble oneself in the presence of others. And remember, humility was castigated in the Greco-Roman world. They didn't like humility. It was for women and weak people. Sorry about that, ladies. And real men were not humble. But Christianity elevated humility, putting other people in front of oneself. It's a distinctly Christian virtue that kills selfishness, that breaks unity. And then finally, Paul says, look to the interests of others, not to your own interests. That's serving. That's Jesus in Mark 10:45. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. If we would follow in the way of Jesus Christ, in humility we serve others. If we have humility and we serve, we put to death selfish ambition and elevate unity among God's people. And Paul says, if you guys will do that, my joy will be totally full. The things that bring Paul joy have nothing to do with him and his stuff, because he's not conceited. He has no selfish ambition, but he lives out what he commends to them. He is humble, and he looks to their interests first. How about you? How about me? How about our lives? Are we able to walk in unity with people because we get ourselves out of the way and put others before us in Christian love? That's what brings fullness of joy. And that Spotlight Philippians, invitation to joy. We'll talk to you next time.